So they actually see free speech and tolerance to be something that enables the people in power to keep controlling. So it's seen as a bad thing, which is hard to get our heads around, but it's not a true tolerance that they're advocating for, even from their own perspective, and they're willing to admit that today.
This is Michael Easley in Context, and a passage that you might be familiar with. The little letter of 1 Peter is really an interesting text because it's a letter that the apostle wrote for those who suffer for the sake of Christ. It's not just generic suffering. It's you're suffering for Christ's sake. In a passage in the 3rd chapter, 1 Peter chapter 3, we read verse 13, "Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience." Now, I'll stop there. I think it's so important. We can suffer for a self-inflicted gunshot wound. We can suffer for stupidity, but Peter is very clear if you suffer for the sake of righteousness. And many of our modern-day apologists will refer to this passage because the word apologia, ready to make a defense, comes out of that text. My guest today has been on the program before. We're privileged to have Natasha Crain back on the broadcast. She's a speaker. She's a podcaster. She's an author. She's written 5 books and counting. She's in great demand, and it's a joy to have you back on the program, Natasha.
Thanks so much. It's great to talk with you.
The new book is When the Culture Hates You. Joyful title, Natasha.
Well, thank you. I tried hard.
Well, it's, I had Janet Parshall on the program recently and some other good friends, and we were talking about why are we surprised that the culture hates us? And that really is the premise of your book, right? That we shouldn't. Christ told us about this, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's funny that you laugh about the title because I've gotten so much of that from people just when they say, "So what are you working on?" "Oh, I have a new book out." "Oh, what's it called?" "When Culture Hates You." And you get 2 very different responses. You have Christians who are really engaged in the cultural issues. They understand what's going on. They're passionate about it. And they immediately say, "Oh, that's good. I get that." They feel that, right? And then you have other Christians who are kind of like, "Oh, okay. Isn't that a little bit strong?" And yeah, I've even seen some Amazon reviews that say like, "Oh, this is such a great book. You just have to get past the title," as if we all know that, using the word hate is just so outlandish, right? We've become so sensitive, I think, even in the church, to words like hate, that we think it's a bad thing. But in the book, I make the bold and I think biblically accurate case that is indeed the right word to use, that Jesus told his disciples, if the world hates you, there we go, there's that word, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But you are not of the world. I've chosen you out of the world, and therefore the world hates you. So yes, we shouldn't be surprised at all. This is what Jesus said would happen.
Before we get into some of the details, can we differentiate between being hated because of a position, of a political position that may or may not be a biblical theological point, but they hate us because fill in the blank? And that's why I wanted to read Peter's comment, because we can suffer for a lot of self-inflicted stupidity. We can be hated for positions that may or may not be clearly biblical. If I'm hated for being a Christian, presenting the gospel, and I love the way Peter he elaborates on that. He says, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, make a defense, give a hope, with gentleness and reverence. And sometimes, you know this as well as anyone, it's combative, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because sometimes Christians take this too far and think that, well, if people hate me, that's just what Jesus said, and so I don't have to do any kind of self-reflection, right? And that's not at all what I'm getting at in the book. I think that we always have to reflect and say, if someone hates me, if this is a personal kind of relationship, for example, and someone is really upset with me, is it because of the way I delivered the message? Am I being a jerk in what I'm saying? Am I not saying this out of a motivation of love? Because if I'm not, then there is a problem that has to be solved on my end. However, we can't gauge whether or not we are sharing truth in God's way just by people's responses, because we can be sharing truth in the most loving way according to God's definition of love, and people can still hate us because we learn from Scripture that righteousness is despised by a fallen world. And so when we share God's truth, it's going to be offensive. It's going to upset people. We just always want to be reflective and make sure that it's the message itself that's being hated as Jesus said it would be, and not our delivery of it. We don't want to get in the way of a message that the world already finds offensive.
Mm-hmm. You write, to that point, you write, righteousness is despised by a fallen world. When the children of God practice righteousness, they shine light on the works of the world, unveiling the truth of what they are, evil. Of course, those who are of the world will hate that, and they'll hate you for making it happen. You know, I've used the word evil more in the past 5 or 6 years and over 40 years of ministry, because it just seems, Natasha, there's no explanation apart from the word evil.
It's true. And I think that was a big motivation for writing this book, was not just to outline, here's a biblical view of some of these big issues today, and here's how we think about our influence in the public square, but to actually get inside the mind of the culture to understand, why do they hate us? It could be in this hypothetical world that we were at odds with our beliefs and culture, but the culture was just thinking, you know what, you Christians, you guys have some things really wrong. We disagree with you. We don't see that kind of mentality today, or that kind of approach. What we hear is, hey, Christians, you're toxic, you're harmful, you're bigoted, you're hateful. I mean, we hear all these words. There's clearly this anger toward Christians, and indeed a hatred, just as Jesus said that we would experience. And ultimately, it is a spiritual battle. And as I say at the very end of the book, in the epilogue, I think that when you really get into the mindset of culture, which I did for several months as I was preparing to write this book, to really just immerse myself in the content produced from a non-biblical view on all of these issues, you just realize that the culture is in deep rebellion against the Creator. And it all comes back to wanting to be our own authority on all things. We want to be the authority on what is true, what is good and bad and harmful and helpful and right and wrong. And when you tell somebody, hey, you're not the authority, there's actually a creator and sustainer of the universe who's not only out there, but has revealed himself and what's required of us and who we are and who he is through the Bible, now people are going to hate you for that. And so it is ultimately evil, because it is self-worship versus God worship.
Where do you think it started? I'm quite a bit older than you, and I think there was a time certainly where you had renowned atheists. You had a Madalyn Murray O'Hair. The media was not what it is today. It was far more less outlets. There were less information coming at you. And so you kind of knew who the enemies were, so to speak. You knew what to expect. But with the proliferation of information, social media, et cetera, what's your assessment of studying the culture? Where did this begin?
Well, it began a long time ago, and I think that's what is really important for Christians to understand, that it seems to us, I think, that the last 10 years or so, or the last 15 years, things have gone crazy. I think for a lot of Christians, that's how it seems. But that's really the end snowball of a much longer progression of these things. So you can start looking back, to the 1800s. I mean, you could even trace this back much further than that if you really wanted to get into the details of it. But as you get into the late 1800s and into the 1900s with the sexual revolution that takes place and all of these ideas starting to come to fruition, we're just seeing the fruit of a tree that's been growing for a very long time. Because once you started throwing out the Bible as God's truth, and overwhelmingly society starts moving away from that, we were holding on as a society to a lot of these, so-called Judeo-Christian values that the country was founded upon, but without the doctrinal underlying root of that. And so it was just a matter of time, once we started throwing out the doctrinal basics of Christianity, that people were going to throw off the values that were tied to that as well. And so this has been in the works for a long time, but it really picked up steam, I think, in the last 15 to 20 years, where you started seeing that now we're throwing off the values as well, not just the doctrine, but the values that were tied to that, because people started realizing, wait a second, why do we value things in our society like the nuclear family? That's just a norm. That's just a social construct. You see this hatred for the family and any idea that there should be norms around gender and marriage and the family structure. So once you get to that point where people realize, hey, I guess we don't need any of that anymore. It's not just Christianity, but the values too. You're going to see that just pick up at a very rapid pace. And I think not to go too far off topic, but I think the next step in that is what I talk about in the final chapter of the book, which is the sexualization of children, and how activists are now, a subset of activists are now advocating for the so-called sexual liberation of children. A lot of Christians think, oh, well, that's never going to happen. I mean, we haven't accepted that as a society, but that's just the next step in the same revolution that's already produced what we're seeing accepted. So things are picking up speed, but it has roots going back a lot longer than we think.
I guess ostensibly you can say, when the question was asked, has God said? I've often remarked that God made man in his image, and man's been making God in his image ever since, because we want to worship a God. And the conversations I've had over the years with people that don't know Christ, I can never believe in a God who, or I can never believe in a God that. And in my kinder apologetic efforts, I would say, so what you've just said is better than this God, that you would have a construct of how God should do things. You're smarter. Well, I don't mean that. Well, no, that's effectively what you said. I can never believe in a God who. Let's talk about your chapter on defining the common good. Again, this is sort of a pervasive philosophy. And I mean, things like inclusion and diversity and tolerance, that language was hijacked and redefined. And so help us out.
Yeah, so the common good is also a term that's been used in a whole lot of different ways to mean very different things over time. And I'm not importing any of those meanings into how I'm using it in the book. So as I explain in that chapter, my definition of the common good is very basic to what is actually good based on God's standards for the common lives that we hold together as a society. So what does human flourishing truly look like? And ultimately, when we talk about something like the so-called culture war, for example, a lot of times Christians get a little bit, afraid. They kind of sit back and say, well, I don't want to be in the culture war. But all that means really is that there's a passionate disagreement in the public square over what is good for society. That's what that is. You have people on one side saying, I want what's good for society. And you have people on the other side saying, I want what's good for society. No one's saying, I want what's bad for society. Everyone thinks they're advocating for what is good, right? That's what the culture war is. It's what is actually good for society. So as Christians, we just need so much more clarity, I think. And that was a catalyst for this book, to hopefully help people think about that more deeply, to not just say, well, lots of people have different ideas about what is good. How can we actually sort this all out? Let's just all be happy together and be peaceful and sit back and not get involved. But we know as Christians that non-Christians will call good evil and evil good. So if we as Christians are not going to be the ones advocating for what is truly good according to God's standards and against what is truly evil according to his standards, then who is? We have to be ready to advocate for the moral health of our society. And so that's really what I'm getting at in the book when it comes to the common good, and thinking through with clarity, what does good look like according to God and not according to man's standards, because those will be very different.
When we think of some of the vitriol from what's good for society that would be against a biblical theological worldview, how much of that comes out of hurt? People being wounded and things happening to them?
The hatred, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, when you look, and I don't want to be condescending or trivial, but when you see a feminization issue that is so vitriolic to a white male pastor, for example, as an illustration, something happened there that person is so angry, or a person that is so pro-abortion and they're so angry about it. The vitriol is so strong. Again, in my naivety, perhaps, Natasha, has been they were hurt somewhere in the backstory, which is where that anger may come from. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of individual cases, that is certainly true. I mean, when you see, you give the example of abortion, I think that for a lot of women who actually experience the pain of going through that, they don't want to confront that. And so they're going to completely flip this on its head and make it something that they're going to say they're actually now proud of. A few years ago, there was a shout your abortion movement where women were encouraging one another to hashtag shout your abortion and say, my abortion is actually something that made me happy, and therefore it's okay. That's the underlying logic. And so in my last book, In Faithfully Different, I talk about the 4 tenets of secularism, which are basically that feelings are your ultimate guide, happiness is your ultimate goal, and judging is the ultimate sin, God is the ultimate guess. So with the happiness portion of that being the ultimate goal of life, when you have a secular culture that isn't rooted in biblical truth, then you're going to see a lot of people who are going after happiness and thinking that that is the ultimate goal. And you can justify a whole lot of things by saying, well, it made me happy, right? I had an abortion, but it made me happy because now I can pursue what I want. And so for anyone to come alongside you and quote unquote judge you, remember, that's the ultimate sin in this society. Now you're going to be angry because now you're going to say, well, who are you to judge me? Who are you to tell me how I feel or what makes me happy? Because they're presupposing that those are your ultimate guide. They're presupposing that they are their own authority. And so when you claim to be the authority and say, no, this is wrong, you're actually killing a preborn baby. This is morally wrong. You've done something wrong. People don't want to hear that. And of course, as Christians, what we have to understand, because Christians get confused on this too, is that we're not the ultimate judge. We're not the authority. People will accuse us of trying to take that space, but we have to be clear in talking with people. We're not claiming to be the judge. We're claiming that there is an ultimate judge, someone who has already judged and who has revealed his judgments about what is good and bad and true and false in the Bible. And so we're passing on that information when we share God's truth. It's not our truth, it's God's truth, and we're just the messengers. But I do think that there is a lot of hurt that comes from people on a lot of these issues, or struggles, when it comes to something like sexuality, a very difficult kind of struggle that people have. Sometimes people in their lives who are Christians have not handled that well, right? And so they're going to react against Christianity and Christians a lot more strongly than from a purely intellectual position of, oh, I think you're wrong about that. No, it's very personal at that point. So there is a lot of that, in addition to the wider cultural issues that, like I said, have been stewing for the last 100+ years.
We've talked historically in the last decade about tribes. We all have influences. An artist may have a tribe, an author has a tribe, and it seems that these issues kind of traffic in tribes. When the Me Too movement came out, there was definitely a tribe. A lot of people were hurt, and you don't want to dismiss the hurt. But the way it's handled, the way there's an amalgamation of tribes, almost like a Lord of the Rings, a Lord of the Flies type effect. It's just this mass mob mentality comes out of an ill-defined issue.
Yeah, I think social media has aided that a lot, right? Because you see people saying things on social media, and then it's just a matter of how many likes am I going to accrue? How many comments can I accrue of people coming alongside and saying, hey, I'm on your team? So everything ends up looking like this kind of battle between mobs, as you say. Yeah. And so that tribalism can really affect how people think about things. But I still believe that there is good value in being involved in social media. A lot of people will ask me about that. Like, should you even get involved in that? Should you even put your, should you speak God's truth in social media? And it's oftentimes not so much for the person that you're responding to, because a lot of times that person who posted, they're really entrenched in being a leader of the tribe, a leader of that mob, as you're saying. But when you comment in a gracious way as a Christian and you share God's truth in a very reasonable, loving way, not everyone's going to like you for it, but there are people who are looking on. They're the onlookers on social media that maybe never say a word, but that you've kind of shown them, okay, well, this is what Christians believe and this is how it can be said. So you represent Jesus even on social media. And I've heard many stories come out of people seeing those kinds of engagements online, didn't participate, but it absolutely swayed them and it showed them God's truth. So I think it's a good thing still.
And I applaud that mindset. I have a friend who's an evangelist, and he often says, most people are terrified to share the gospel. They don't know how, and they're afraid. And he said, but when you share the gospel, people may or may not respond to the word of Christ, but other Christians see and hear you share the gospel, it emboldens them. And to your point, you may never hear that backstory, but because Larry was so kind and loving and persistent and tenacious about sharing Christ with his friends, that emboldens me to say, Michael, you need to be more like Larry, and not just like Larry, but you draw courage from that to go, hey, I can do that. I can, in Christ's power and encouragement. One of the issues I struggle with, Natasha, and it's this concept of engaging the culture. And in your fourth chapter, you talk about, should Christians impose their views on others? And you give 4 very insightful objections. Christians shouldn't impose their views on others and how we respond to them. They shouldn't seek power. The getting involved in politics harms our witness. Political divisions disrupt the unity in the church. And hear me out here. I'm not against engaging individuals and neighbors and people in my sphere of influence. But when I hear anyone, I'm not saying you, but when I hear the phrase engage the culture, it almost seems like change the world. It just seems like this ominous thing. How am I supposed to engage the culture as a Christian that's trying to raise my kids, homeschool them, work, pay off my debt, engage the culture?
Yeah, and just to be clear on those objections that you listed, those are objections that I often hear to public engagement that I would not agree with, and I respond to in that chapter to give people an understanding of what.
Sorry for not being clear. But I'm sorry not being clear. But help me back with that. I think a lot of Christians hear this engage the culture nomenclature, and they're off-put by it, and they go, well, it's sort of like the nightly news is too much to handle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good question, because I think that, reading a book like this where it's like, okay, we need to understand and engage on these issues like abortion and gender and sexuality and false justice and what's going on with Christian nationalism, how you have all these issues, and it can be overwhelming. My hope is that Christians will understand that do something, do anything, but do something, right? That we are called to be salt and light, and we are called to take no parts in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Excuse me. And so that's from Ephesians. So what I want to communicate through the book is really, here are some different ways that you can get involved in these different issues. So in the second half of the book, for example, I cover 5 different major issues where the culture hates us, and yet the Christian light is so urgently needed. And at the end of each of those chapters, I give 7 action points for the common good that you can take with those issues. So no, not everyone is going to be out there advocating with the local school board, for example. But that's just one way that you can get involved. Not everyone is even physically capable of leaving their house, but there are organizations that you can pray for who are actively out there, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, for example, who are advocating for things like parental rights in culture. You can pray for them. You can support them financially. You can become really aware of and educated about what they're doing so that you can then equip people at your church with that knowledge. And once they're equipped, maybe they're the ones who are more capable of going out and getting involved in some other kinds of ways. So when we say engage the culture, it doesn't mean one person's changing the world, but it does mean that if Jesus called his followers to be salt and light, that's inherently of a public activity, that we are loving others for what we do in caring about the moral health of our society, sharing about the gospel, yes, and caring about the health of society. That's a common thing that people say, well, I just think we should, share the gospel. Of course we should. Of course, because ultimately it's people's salvation that is the ultimate issue. But we can also multitask. I like to say it. It's a false dichotomy to think it's either sharing the gospel or caring about the health of society. It's both. It's both. And we should all be looking at how we can love others in both of those ways.
I often use the phrase sphere of influence. So we all have a sphere of influence, whether it's a neighborhood, where you get your hair done or a guy gets his hair cut. This is the traffic pattern of life and getting to know those people. Let me go over your 7 actions points are very helpful. Educate yourself on political relevance for Christians. Get to know your representatives and senators in both the U.S. and state governments. And just by the by, we lived in the D.C. area for about 12 years. Writing, not email, not text, but writing a letter, it can be typed, and signing it to your representative is huge. It's huge, and people don't understand the weight of that. And going to a rally or a fundraiser for a candidate, even if you don't intend to support them, to shake their hand, look them in the eye. I met the governor of Tennessee a number of times, and the other day I saw him at an event. Now, he was mobbed, and I just went up and said, "Thank you for what you're doing, praying for you and your family." And he just was, and it's not that hard to look at where you traffic in life. I digress. Vote.
But I think that's so important what you said is that it makes me think of a lot of times. I'm an introvert, for example, and a lot of introverts will say, they would listen to what you just said and they would say, "There's no way I could get out and do that." And I would be intimidated to do some of what you just described. Like, I've never marched in a rally, for example, personally. But there are things that everyone can do that are within their giftings and within their passion areas. So if people are looking for what's one thing I can do? I would say some of these issues undoubtedly that I talk about in the book that I listed earlier, some of them undoubtedly you are dealing with in your own life. And if that's the case, for example, if you have a family member who is identifying as transgender now, well, maybe that's a really relevant issue for you to better understand and to think through. So maybe that's where you need to learn more and take action more and see what you can do. In other cases, if you're not dealing with these specific issues, just pick one that maybe you have especially a heart for. If it's the sanctity of life, then see what can I do? It doesn't necessarily mean you have to go be in the March for Life. It could mean that, but it could also mean a lot of other things. It could mean that you're taking your local youth group to tour a local pregnancy center so that they better understand the issue themselves. And then those students eventually go on to make a big difference in the world. There's so many ways that you can be salt and light without feeling like, I have to go against what I'm capable of, what I, feel called to, my introvert personality, all of those things. There's so much we can do.
You say vote, and I laugh at that one because, having both my wife and I are very politically oriented, and it's like, why wouldn't you vote? But that's a different discussion. Follow, donate.
Well, I have to put that in there because there are a lot of people who would say, a lot of Christians who say, well, I don't think we should vote, right? So I have to put it in there. It's the most basic. But
I applaud it. Support a nonprofit organization that advocates politically for specific issues. And I would just, I agree, amen, wholeheartedly, but I'd say really investigate when you do this, because as a friend of mine taught me years ago about, we support missionaries and we give to churches. He said, you're giving to a missionary or a church or a 501c3 should be as critical, if not more, than a financial investment, because what they do with your money, and it's hard, even if it's $25 a month. Anyway, know and get involved in the local school board. Help equip those in your church community with a better understanding of the role of public influence. I just interviewed David Clausen on his new book, Life After Roe.
I'm reading that right now.
Yeah, and extraordinary about, just sidebar, more abortions happened in the first year after the Dobbs decision than the prior year because of chemical abortions, prescription drugs. Unbelievable. These battles aren't over, are they? But anyway, and again, you said it well, but I just kind of circle back to say, you've got this sphere of influence. Maybe your kids are in public school and it's a little iffy. Take the teachers some goodies. Help out with the classroom. Can I come in and help you grade or tidy up? And just be a loving person. You don't have to be emboldened to share Christ the first time you talk to someone, but the fact that you care about the teacher, not just your child in the classroom, the administrator. Take a fruit basket to the teacher's lounge. Thanks for what there's so many things you could do, even as an introvert. You can take some sourdough bread. Everybody's making sourdough. Take some sourdough bread to the teacher. They'll love you for it. And put a little verse in there maybe. I think we get this fear and intimidation. That's why I wanted to talk about engaging the culture. I hear that so often, and I kind of arch my back and go, wait a minute, you're not fighting a culture. You're not against the culture. These are people that have an eternal soul. They're hurt, they're confused, they're misinformed, they're misled. And back to your point, the gospel is our hope, but we also hope that changes lives and changes families, right?
Right, absolutely. And I love that you're putting in terms of the sphere of influence. I mean, that's exactly what it is. Just consider who is in your area and what you can do on those issues. I also want to go back to something that you said, because I think it's so important about where your money goes. So you were reading some of the action points from the chapter on Christian nationalism specifically,
Yes.
but I have those in each of those issues.
Yes.
And one of the ones that I talk about in the false social justice chapter as an action point is when you support organizations that are working for justice issues, it's so important to really look into what they are doing with the money, even if it's labeled a Christian organization, because we know that so many things that are quote unquote Christian today aren't actually operating from a biblical worldview. And some of the largest, most well-known organizations have been found to be pretty lacking in that area. So as Christians, we have to be so mindful about how we're stewarding our money and making sure that it's going to causes that are operating from a biblical perspective.
And not to get too far off on that subject, but with the DEI and the CRT and these major Christian organizations that were incredibly solid for decades,
Yes.
Cindy and I, we were very careful about where we give our money. And we have the number of agencies, organizations, ministries is much shorter and smaller today with larger donations, because I'm like, we worked hard for that money. The Lord gave us that money. I'm a steward of that money. If I have any question mark, I'm sorry. And, and we've had some unpleasant conversations with organizations. Goes, look, until you're clear on this issue, you're not clear. Well, I said, no, you're not clear. You're unclear on this issue. And ministries that I've loved for decades.
Yep.
And say, you're not clear. Let me ask you to open up this chapter about controlling misogynists. I so loved, because in seminary, of course, we understood what misogyny was. In the last 10 years, it's become a household word, which I kind of marvel at. But again, for folks that haven't got the book yet or haven't read it, unpack what you're doing in this chapter.
Yeah, so all the chapters in the second half of the book are basically labeled as the culture sees us. So controlling misogynists is the view from pro-choice activists. And another chapter, for example, is called Dangerous Christian Nationalists, the view from mainstream media. And so all the chapters are labeled in that kind of way. So controlling misogynists refers to how the culture sees us as basically women haters, that we just want to control women. And that's why we are opposed to abortion. And I think it even kind of dawned on me for the first time at this level of depth as I was writing this chapter that when you have people who are advocating so passionately for pro-choice causes and they really just think that having choice is the best thing, overwhelmingly, we have to understand this as Christians, it'll help us engage better. They're not saying we love killing babies. That's overwhelmingly not how they see this. They see this as an issue of harm to women. And so, of course, as Christians who are pro-life, we recognize, but first and foremost, you are killing a preborn baby. And the ways that you're saying that not being able to do so harms women, they don't actually harm women. So yes, as Christians, that is our view, but we have to understand the cultural mindset that you're actually hurting women in some way, according to the pro-choice activists. And we're hurting them because we want to control them. That's the mindset. You just want to control us. And overwhelmingly, that comes from the critical theory underpinnings of secular social justice that we're seeing today, where the whole world is divided into oppressor and oppressed groups based on who has the supposed power in society. So in the case of gender, it's considered that men have power in society and women don't have power, therefore women are oppressed. That's how you get to a view that you are a controlling misogynist if you are advocating against women having the choice to kill their preborn baby, because then it's men telling women what to do. And of course, there are plenty of women who are pro-life also, but that's not the overwhelming view that they take. They just think that it's about people trying to control women's bodies, and you're hurting them by having to tell them what to do. And you can take this down logically, you can take this down biblically. I mean, there's so many ways of approaching that. And that's what I think we have to understand as Christians, that it's not only presenting the view that this is a human being worthy of life. It is that, but it's also being able to answer the culture's perspective that we're hurting women. And so in that chapter, I walk through several of those objections where they're saying that you're hurting women, to show that actually, no, this is not hurting women. And we're going to address head on that we understand that that's what you think. We don't want to hurt women, but this is not hurting women.
It's one of the things I've observed over the last 3 decades is the political parties will take not only do they redefine the nomenclature, but they take what the opposition holds as a view and they vilify it.
Yes.
So, in my worldview experience, I was a white male pastor. So you can vilify me till the cows come home without any repercussion. You vilify an imam, you vilify a lesbian, you vilify an African American person, you're going to go to jail. You're going to have death threats. But you can vilify a white male pastor without any fear of repercussion.
Right.
And it's probably true. Tolerance only works one way, right? It only works my way.
And they're okay with that.
Exactly.
I mean, that's something that I think we have to understand, because a lot of Christians will say, well, how do they not understand that they're not being tolerant of us? But when people talk openly about this, progressives, they will say, well, there shouldn't be free speech, for example, because free speech just emboldens those already in power to continue to oppress those who are marginalized. Mm-hmm. So they actually see free speech and tolerance to be something that enables the people in power to keep controlling. So it's seen as a bad thing, which is hard to get our heads around, but it's not a true tolerance that they're advocating for, even from their own perspective, and they're willing to admit that today. It's no longer, oh no, we are just looking for tolerance. There's tolerance for those who aren't harmful and bigoted and hateful and awful like you Christians.
Yeah, my poor comeback used to be, I'm incredibly intolerant, and so is my God. My God's intolerant of sin.
That's right.
And he put his son on the cross to pay for that intolerance. You discuss so many great issues in the book, but one of the observations, culture often believes Christians are harming the transgender identifying kids. And you spend time talking about with the mutilation happening to children today under the mandate of choice, not of the child really, not of a person that's goodness gracious, we got to get through braces and acne before we make some of these life-changing decisions, right? And yet the culture has just glommed onto this thing.
Right. And it comes down to, how do you define good? It comes back to exactly what we were talking about earlier in the common good and understanding that with clarity. Because ultimately, what is going to be good for a person is going to be based in their design. If there's a creator who has designed you in a certain way and to flourish with a certain purpose, then anything that you do that is in opposition to that is going to be harmful to you no matter what you think. It can't be a subjective thing. You might feel that that's a bad thing, but objectively speaking, you're actually harming yourself if there's a creator who has a design for you. Now, of course, if there's no creator, if atheism were true and we're all just a bunch of molecules in motion, then who cares what you're doing with your body, right? So I think I always try to go back to separating out worldviews when I'm having these conversations with people who are advocating for some of the things that as Christians we know are bad for transgender people, to say, hey, I would agree with you. If there's no creator, if there's no God who has designed people in a certain way and to flourish with a certain perspective, then it doesn't matter what you do with your body. But if there is a creator, which I think that there's good evidence for, and he's revealed himself and who we are in scripture, which there's also good evidence for, then we can look at that and objectively say, this is bad for you, even if you feel like it is good for you. That objectively speaking, that to facilitate these kinds of so-called gender transitions is actually a bad thing. And so it comes back to those different definitions of good. If culture overwhelmingly defines good as whatever makes me happiest, which I do think is overwhelmingly culture's definition, then you're always going to see people advocating for whatever it is that makes them feel happiest, whether it is mutilating bodies or it's killing preborn babies or it's redefining marriage to include 15 different people. It's all going to come back to whatever makes me feel happiest. And as Christians, we've got to have clarity that that is never an indication of what is actually good according to God's standards. So I hope to bring clarity through the book, because I do see so many Christians who get confused on these issues, and they'll say things like, well, I'm personally pro-life, but I don't think that I should, tell other people how they should live. And so there's a confusion on what the Bible says on things. There's a confusion about just basic civics. What does it mean to live in a constitutional republic? What do we have the right to do? Everyone has the right to bring their faith to bear in the public square, but culture has been really successful in telling Christians, no, that's bad. You need to be silent because of quote unquote separation of church and state. And that's that's just not true. That has nothing to do with living in a constitutional republic. So there's a lot of confusion today in the church about these things, both civics and the biblical nature of what we should advocate for.
Excellent. And even rehearsing the happiness approach, these people aren't happy when they go through these things. And that's sort of the level of dissatisfaction. I used to use the illustration that if adultery or immorality satisfied, you would do it one time and it would have satisfied your longings. Sin is insatiable. We will never be happy in pursuit of these, culturally defined, to use your language, terms. You're only, and really happiness it's kind of an anti-biblical term. There's a real joy and a substance of following Christ. He's truthful. He's good to his word. He knows what's best for us, as the perfect Father does. And it's such a, back to our earlier comment, God made man in his image, and man's been remaking God in his lowercase image ever since. And it all goes back to, has God said, right?
That's exactly right. It's funny that the happiness thing, because when I do talks from my book, Faithfully Different, and I talk about those 4 tenets of secularism that I mentioned earlier, and I get to the one where I'm talking about happiness as the ultimate goal, I'll ask people in the audience, I'll say, so how many people here think that God wants you to be happy? And you can just tell at that point in the presentation that no one wants to say anything. Right. I'm breaking them down from all these worldview perspectives and making people think more deeply about things, stop saying follow your heart, stop trying to be your authentic self. You don't want to be your authentic self. I'm going through all these things, and then you get to that, and people are like, no one wants to say a
not
word.
Not so much, yeah.
But it's exactly right. It's when people aren't sure what to make of that. The truth is that it's not that God doesn't necessarily want you to be happy, but he has so much more for us, so many bigger goals for us, right? Yeah. We want joy that is objectively rooted in the knowledge of Jesus as our Lord and Savior. Yeah. Happiness is this subjective feeling that you may or may not feel at a given time, and it can't be the ultimate indicator of whether or not you're doing the right thing in God's eyes. And at that point, I'll ask people, well, how many people here have ever felt unhappy doing what they knew was the right thing to do in God's eyes? And everyone's like, yes, I've been there, right? We all have. So happiness is a really poor guide to making good choices.
Yep. You can be really happy eating that deep dish pizza, and when you finish it, you're going to be unhappy you ate too much, right? It changes so quickly. Well, the book is When Culture Hates You by Natasha Crain, who the Lord is using in some phenomenal ways. It's fun to watch you from the cheap seats, and I just may your tribe increase. And thanks for having the courage to get out of your introvert nature and and put it down and go speak and talk about it. And it's a delight to have you back on the program. So thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thanks so much. It was a great conversation.